Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Good evening. Good evening.
Good evening.
Thank you. I always like to tell people that, I come from Africa, and in Africa we have this really strange custom that when somebody greets you, you answer. Bizarre, isn't it? Thank you. It is a great honor for me to be asked to be a speaker at the annual Human Rights Banquet. Before I start, I would like to thank Tony and Michelle for driving to Spokane in the middle of the night, and especially since they were given the wrong flight number, and they could have turned around and left me there. So thank you for not doing so. I talk about healing the wounds of racism, and I come to that discussion from the South African perspective, having grown up in apartheid South Africa, and then coming through a process of truth and reconciliation to the beginning, the building of a new South Africa, a South Africa that views all of its citizens as being worthy human beings, worthy citizens, people with much to offer our country. But I also come to that experience from living all over the world and seeing how much our wounds must still be healed in South Africa, in this country, and in countries all over the world. And when I think about healing wounds, particularly healing wounds of racism, I think that we have to start with accepting that there are wounds. We have to start with accepting that there is a truth that we must tell ourselves and each other about our knowledge, our experience, our participation in racism. Whenever I do workshops on race and racism, I tell people that for me, the scariest people are those who say, "Oh, I don't see race," or who say, "I don't have a racist bone in my body." Those are the ones who I run from as quickly as possible. Because if we cannot at least admit that exists within us, then how can we start to heal? How can we move forward? There are always those people who say, "Oh, I don't see difference. I don't see race. All I see are human beings." And without fail, those people will always say, "Look at children. Children don't see difference." And I say to them, "Which children have you been hanging around?" Because all the children I know notice difference. But the difference between them and us is that for them, difference is something amazing. It is an opportunity to learn something new. And that if we allow them, they simply ask questions about difference as an opportunity to learn. But so very often, we scare them into being silent about the difference. I tell people that for me, it is amazing that we would say that when it comes to us, that we would think that there's some level of pride in saying, "I don't see difference." Because it is only actually in talking about ourselves that we say that. That you never hear somebody looking at your garden and saying, "Oh, what a beautiful garden. I don't see roses and pansies," and I'm really bad at garden stuff. I always tell people when they say, "What flower is that?" I say, "I know a rose and not a rose," okay? But that people don't say, "I don't see roses and daffodils and tulips, all I see are flowers." They don't even say, "I don't see red roses, pink roses, yellow roses, white roses, all I see are roses." They say, "I see the beauty of these diverse flowers in your garden." And so why can we experience and celebrate difference in the rest of God's creation and not celebrate and recognize the difference that exists in us and amongst us. So for me, the first step is to speak the truth, to admit and celebrate that we see difference. I am one of those people who, until a couple of years ago, I would change my hairdo very regularly. And it was mostly because I was lazy and I was trying to find the easiest hairdo I could find. And so for a while, I had actually shaved all my hair off. And one day I'm sitting in a plane going somewhere, and a young couple comes on with a 3 or 4-year-old boy, and he walks onto the plane, and then he, why does that woman have no hair? And his parents are like, come on, Johnny. Yeah, that's fine, that's fine. And I thought, oh my goodness, this poor child is going to be terrified of bald women. So I said, no, that's fine, that's fine. You know, I don't have any hair because I'm just too lazy to comb my hair. You know, there's not some big bald women conspiracy going on. And yet, so very often that is what we do to our children when they first start to question. And I know, I have 3, and I know that there are times when their questions and their noticing of difference can be embarrassing. And there are many, many times when my children have said something or asked a question, and I've just said, I wonder whose child that is. Isn't that an interesting, intelligent question that child is asking? I wonder who his mother is. But seriously, that we have a need and an opportunity to start telling the truth about what we know and what we don't know and what we need to know about each other. One of the workshops that I actually do with a friend of mine, Rose Bader, on race and race relations. And we started doing this workshop out of the experience of our friendship. And we met and had been friends now we'd been friends for about 6 months, and I said something to her about being black. And she said to me, oh, I don't think of you as black. And she says that I immediately jumped down her throat. I say I counted up to 10 and then very calmly said, what do you mean you don't think of me as black? And she's not here, I am, so you know who's telling the truth. But that experience of being told, I don't think of you as black, has been the foundation now of our workshop. And whenever we do the workshop, we always find that people of color in the room immediately identify with that statement, that some point in their life, somebody has said or intimated that, I don't think of you as a member of your particular race or your particular ethnic group, and that very often white people in the room look surprised. And so before we do the workshop, we often send out a little pamphlet talking about our story, and ask people to think about whether they have ever said a statement like that, or whether they have ever heard a statement like that. And a few months ago, we were doing the workshop, and 2 responses that we got from participants to me encapsulated some of the wounds of racism. Because we had one woman, an African-American woman, who said, when I was growing up, because I grew up in this predominantly white community, that when people would say to me, I don't think of you as black, I would actually feel complimented. And I realized that I felt complimented because there was a stigma, a story that people in this community had about black people. And so when they said they didn't think of me as black, I thought, phew, I'm fine, I'm okay. And then the other was a white woman who said, when you first sent me the pamphlet and I read this and I thought, well, what's wrong with it? I have very good friends who I don't think of as black. And then I sat with it and I thought about it and went down a level. And I realized that, yes, those friends that before I said I don't think of them as black, the thing that came before that was that I trust them and respect them. And then I don't think of them as black. And I think that experience, those stories, are so much a part of the stories of all of us. The stories of what racism has taught us about ourselves and about each other, but also the way in which racism has wounded us all, has kept us apart from one another, unwilling or unable to speak or even to hear our own truth, forget about the truth of the other. When I first moved to Cape Town, I grew up in South Africa but grew up in Soweto, in Gauteng. And I moved to Cape Town and was asked to take part in a program that was bringing together African and colored gender activists in Cape Town. Now, I have to explain a little bit about South Africa's racial classifications in order to make this story make sense to anybody. In South Africa, we had an amazing array of racial classifications, but the four writ large were, and I'm going to put them in the order of privilege under apartheid, was white, and just look around the room, and pretty well represented in this room, I have to say. And then we had Asian, and in South Africa, Asian is not the same as Asian in this country. In South Africa, the Asian population is predominantly people from the Indian subcontinent. And that's because South Africa and India were British colonies at the same time. And if you know anything about the British, they move people like you move furniture, so it's like, oh, we need some workers in Africa, oh, move them from India. We need some workers in America, oh, move them from Africa. Oh, so, so there is a substantial Asian population in South Africa. Chinese in South Africa was sometimes classified under colored, which I'm going to describe in a minute, and in other places were a subcategory of either Asian or colored, depending on I'm not sure what. And Japanese were honorary white in South Africa because South Africa had a very important trading partnership with Japan, and therefore, racial purity can go out the window when economics comes in. And interestingly enough, the other people who were honorary white in South Africa were African Americans. And so I always tell African Americans, if you ever wanted to experience what it was like to be white, you should have come to South Africa under apartheid. You've missed your chance now, sorry. Not gonna happen. I'm not sure where you're gonna get that opportunity ever again. And then colored, which were people of mixed ancestry. Now, the ancestry is really important because under apartheid, interracial marriage and interracial sex were illegal, so we should not have had an interracial population. However, when the first Europeans arrived, they were mostly sailors and traders, and in those days, I understand sailors and traders were predominantly men, and then they came onto the continent and made friends with African women. So I'm keeping this PG rated. I saw young people out there. So, and then African, which was people who I thought growing up were people who looked like me, until I moved to Cape Town. I have to back up a little bit. One of the wonderful things about apartheid was that you could actually apply to have your racial classification changed. And in fact, twice a year, the government, in the government gazette, put out the numbers, like 5 whites have been reclassified as colored, 20 coloreds are now white, 6 Asians are now, I personally think that it was part of a full employment program for the South African government, that there were people who had to fill out, look at people's application to change their racial classification. What do you make of that? And the Western Cape, where Cape Town is located, was under apartheid a colored preferential area. So while coloreds were slightly better privileged in the rest of South Africa than Africans, in the Western Cape, they were even more slightly better privileged, if that makes any sense. And so in the Western Cape, you found a lot of people who looked like me who classified themselves as colored and were basically passing, if you understand that from your history. But what had happened was that because of the colored preferential area, there was a tension between African and colored in the Western Cape that didn't exist in the rest of the country. And so I was asked to be part of a program that brought together gender activists, African and colored gender activists, to talk about our stories, what we knew about ourselves and what we knew about the other. And the person who organized this program was a psychology professor. And I always tell people, beware of psychology professors, because they talk a good game. They say to you, come and join this panel. And you say, oh, okay, fine. And then you get to the panel and they're like, you know what? We're not having an academic discussion. I want you to go down deep into the deepest, darkest parts of your soul and mind and history and come and share this publicly. And and so we volunteered to open our deepest, darkest souls to a group of people in Cape Town. And so she said, when we got there, she said, what I want you to do is we're going to meet for a month before this actual panel happens. And initially, I want you to meet Africans with Africans, coloreds with coloreds, and to talk about what you know about being African and what you know about coloreds. And as coloreds, I want you to talk about what you know about being colored and what you know about Africans. And so we went into our separate groups, and knowing that we're going to come back at some point and share our stories. And when we came to our group as Africans, we were split personality, basically. We had, on the one hand, the pride of being the original people of South Africa. And in fact, in our languages, the word for African is the same as the word for human being. So, somebody will say, how many people were at the party? And they'll say, oh, there were 20 people and then 3 whites and 4 Asians and 2 colored. So, we're the people and the rest of you are just visiting, So there was that sense of pride of being the original people of South Africa. But then there were the lessons that we had learned from apartheid, that we were somehow less than, and how we had taken those in. And talked about the different ways that we had taken in those lessons. And the one that for me was always striking was that in our weddings. And if you ever get invited to a South African wedding, set aside about 2 weeks, because that's how long our weddings can go. And if you're asked to be a bridesmaid for a South African wedding, say, no, thank you. Because you have to buy about 12 outfits, because you keep changing clothes and going out and letting people see you. You walk and sing in the streets and then go back and change and then come back out, and it can break your bank balance, I'm telling you. So, but that one of the songs, the main songs that is sung when the bride first comes out of her home is, "Come out and see our child, she looks like a colored." So for an African to be a beautiful bride, she looks like a colored. And that, that clearly our idea and our identity was that African is not beautiful. And then we came back with our colored colleagues and talked about what we knew about each other. And don't you know that we knew all the same things about each other? Africans knew that coloreds were lazy, coloreds knew that Africans were lazy. Africans knew that coloreds did not value education, coloreds knew that Africans don't value education. Africans knew that coloreds were dirty, coloreds knew that just on and on and on. The pictures, the negative things that existed in both our communities, we put as identities of the other. And I use that example because that's an example that is personal to my life. But the challenge that I put to you with that example is that if you are serious about ending racism, is to ask you to sit and know, what do I know about myself? What do I know about my group? And what do I know about the other? What do I know about the other? Because when we honestly listen to ourselves, not to anybody else, when we listen to ourselves, the prejudice, the stereotypes are there. And until and unless we are willing to claim those stories, we can't even begin to heal. For a few years, I taught at the University of Hartford, and I was asked to teach a course on the Black experience in the Western Hemisphere. And I don't know about other professors, but what I would do would be at the beginning of the year, I would ask students, ask them to fill out a sheet about who they are and why they're taking the class and what it is they would like to learn in this class. And make students feel good. They don't have to know you throw away that piece of paper afterwards. It's like, but that I was amazed when I first started teaching the course that over and over African American students would say, "I've come to this course because I want to learn about the experience of slavery." And I would think, you've been through this country's education system for 12 years and you're just now getting to college and wanting to learn about slavery? What have you been doing? And then I had children in school in this country, and I found out that in the social studies and histories book that the story of slavery was that much, a paragraph. And I'm thinking, well, that was not a paragraph in this country's history. So how can we be teaching our children something that was such a big part of the founding and the continuing system of this country and only give it a paragraph? And for me, what that says is we're not ready to tell the truth. That is a history. That is the history of this country. And when we give it a paragraph in our history books, then we are doing ourselves, our history, and our future a disservice. Because again, if we don't claim it, we cannot move forward from it. And I tell people that for me, I think one of the biggest learnings from our country, South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation Commission, was for the bravery and the experiences of people who appeared. But the biggest for me was that it was a coming clean about our history. And it was a claiming of our whole history. And as President Mandela said, he said, you know, we cannot, as South Africans, go out into the world and say, yes, we are the country that gave the world Nelson Mandela, this great magnanimous person who came out and was ready to forgive and who still invites his prison guards to his birthday parties. I'm not sure that I'm quite there yet, but thank goodness somebody is. If we cannot also say that we are the country that gave the world Eugene de Kock, who was the man who was in charge of one of the torture and murder farms in South Africa. So that if we are going to be whole, we have to claim our whole story. We have to be willing to tell the whole story, not just the parts of the story that make us proud. Now, I live in Nashville, and I was telling people at lunch that for me, a very frightening fact that I've just come to realize is that I have lived in Nashville longer than I have lived anywhere else in my life consistently. That's a scary thing, you know? I mean, and I tell people that, you know, if when I was growing up in South Africa, somebody had said to me, you're going to spend more time in Nashville, Tennessee than anywhere else in the world, I'd say, yeah, right. Huh. Who wants to be, I like Nashville, actually. But we've been in the center of the whole discussion about the Confederate flag. And I have been struck that when people are asked about flying the Confederate flag, that they say, oh, we want to celebrate the bravery of our ancestors, the fact that they were brave soldiers, that they stood, that they fought bravely, that they represented something great in our history. But then when you say to them, but what about the fact that they were fighting to support slavery? And they're saying, no, we're not talking about that. Well, how can you not talk about that? We have to talk about the whole story. And once we do start talking about the whole story, we actually discover that it opens for us real opportunities for not just friendship, but for growth in our communities, that it doesn't just simply open up for us an opportunity to heal, but it opens up for us an opportunity to be great. And so I trust that you are here aiming for greatness, aiming for healing. And I challenge you to speak the truth, to tell your whole story, and listen to the whole story of those whom you know as other. Thank you.